Are we the same as yesterday? Not quite. Okay, so let's start with reciting the Four Immeasurable Thoughts on page 7. And we'll do the short one. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from the happiness that is without suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from both attachment and hatred, holding some close and others distant. And so just letting those four sink in. So yesterday we did an overview and then we focused specifically on compassion and love. So before we move on to joy and equanimity, tell me what is immeasurable love? What is it?
Love that can't be measured.
Cheeky. Quite right, though. Quite right. Immeasurable in the sense of the sentient beings it's directed at, right? And the amount and the capacity and, yep, all of the words that immeasurable would connote. Yep. But what is love? What is love?
May they be happy without strings.
May
they be happy with no strings attached.
No strings attached. Yep.
Without attachment.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, without attachment. Yep, without attachment and without what else? What's the opposite of love? Hatred, yeah. Okay. You got it? Tick. Done. Everyone's very loving now and your work is done. Did you have any thoughts come up after the class ended yesterday? Just some interesting connections or places where you found you weren't deepening your practice in the way you wanted to, or anything like that? Any moments of self-awareness?
Many. Last night I found.
Yep.
Because I was quite surprised how, when we did some of the meditations yesterday, how quickly I reverted to about me.
Yeah. Yep.
So that person's situation, mine is worse.
Yep. Yeah, it's so easy to centralize back on yourself as the kind of primary focal object of primary importance. It's quite natural, isn't it? Yeah.
Yesterday did help me to move through the turmoil that had been occurring and
Oh, good.
Yes.
Bit of Dharma. Should be right. Yeah, right. Bit of Dharma, bit of drama. That's life, isn't it? Yeah. No, it is interesting, hey, because it's not like you didn't know these concepts before we talked about them, but just sort of you have to refresh and refresh and refresh and deepen and deepen, right? Tell me some things about compassion. What is compassion? Yeah, Jax.
Wishing and sentient all sentient beings free from suffering.
Perfect. All sentient beings free from suffering. What looks like compassion but isn't? Pity. Yep. Yep. What looks like compassion and isn't besides pity? Sympathy. Yeah. It's not so much like a enemy of compassion, but it's not quite compassion. Absolutely. Yeah. Same like empathy. It's not like a bad thing necessarily, but it's not quite compassion. Yeah. Do you remember when we were talking about like empathic distress and getting upset in seeing the suffering of others? So you do want others to be free of their suffering, but you're really worked up observing it. Yeah. And then the opposite being, again, similar to love, things like anger, hatred, ill will.
Not caring.
Boredom, not caring certainly doesn't help, but that's more related to the opposite of joy. Yep. Absolutely. So All right, so we'll move on to joy then, unless you had some questions that you wanted to ask from yesterday before you kind of lost them. Anything about the 3 types of compassion? Anything about some of the nuances of love that you wanted to unpack before we move on?
I have a question.
Sure, yeah.
So I work in an area where we talk a lot about parents' attachment with their children.
Yep.
So I struggled a bit with
The terminology and yeah.
yesterday, and I was just wondering if we had some guidance or words for something else I could use in that area.
Yeah, I mean, when you're with people who use attachment in the kind of more positive sense of having a close bond like parent and child, I think we just have to be aware of our audience, I think. And, I'm prone to a lot of disclaimers. I'm prone to, look, when I use this word in this context, I mean it in this way, and when I use this word in this context, I mean it in this way. And even that process of having the disclaimers and the clarifications ready at your fingertips also tidies your own thinking. It makes your own thinking much more precise, so that when you're talking to psychologists and social workers and you're talking about attachment, you know what you mean. And so the meaning is coming through whatever word you use, and you still use words that make sense to them, because that's the framework they're used to. And then when you're talking to Buddhist people and you're talking about attachment, you're coming from a different framework, and so it's got this other connotation. So I don't know that we need to change our language per se, we just have to know who we're talking to. Yeah, because it is, English isn't quite as nuanced about states of mind as Tibetan is, as, Hindi is, as Sanskrit is, as Pali is. There's not quite as many nuanced terms, and so sometimes it's like as good as we can get. Yeah.
Almost any language
Yeah.
has more nuance.
Yeah. Things get lost in translation. Yeah. I mean, Tibetans don't have many ways to say I am going, but they've got tons of ways of saying this state of mind, that state of mind, this state of mind, that state of mind. But when Tibetan people are learning English and they learn that we can say I'm going, I'm thinking about going, I'm traveling, I'm this, I'm that, and all these different ways of saying the same thing, they're so annoyed, right? Because they just have just the one way to say it. There's just the one way, I'm going, right? But then when it gets to mind, it's really fascinating, yeah. So they've got their main 51 mental states that they talk about, the main 51, but of course 84,000 different delusions, etc., etc. So when you read through the list in English, they're sentences rather than words because we don't have enough words. Yeah, it's interesting, yeah. So, all right, so attachment is a big one, and attachment's going to keep coming up, and what it actually is experientially, it's something that really requires a lot of deep introspection, a lot of deep introspection, because anger is pretty easy to, be aware of. When you're angry, if you take a minute, you know that you're angry. You don't have to work it out too much, right? You can feel yourself agitated. You can feel sort of a heat in the cheeks or a pit in your stomach or a tightness. It's pretty obvious when anger is present, and it's uncomfortable, right? So it's easy enough to say, I'd like to work on my anger. It's not comfortable. It hurts myself and others. Attachment is different because sometimes attachment is pleasant. Yeah, when we have a lot of attachment, it can be very sort of, right? And so then part of us doesn't really want to get rid of it because it's like, well, this is nice, right? And what we're not realizing is that the pleasurable feeling is coming from old positive states of mind ripening and now exhausting, and what we're creating is negative seeds which will later be suffering, right? So what we're experiencing as pleasure actually isn't pleasure, yeah? We're ripening old seeds of positive karma and having a nice experience because of that. And, running out of resources because we're not topping up, right? So attachment, you got to watch that feeling of this is so beautiful, this is so pleasant, this is so intriguing, this is such a rush, and be able to enjoy that. It's not like you have to stop enjoying life. In fact, you enjoy life more with less attachment. What you're doing is you're enjoying fully while at the same time realizing this does not exist from its own side. Yeah? Where this feeling seems to be coming from is not where it came from. Yeah? But I can still enjoy it. Yeah, and then it's really liberating, right? So it's not at all about getting rid of pleasure. It's about seeing it for what it is and where it came from, and actually then you can go from happiness to happiness all the way to complete enlightenment. Does it make sense? Yeah, so attachment's tricky because it's just, there's so much stickiness, you know? And the mind can just kind of blend with it in such a way that it becomes very hard to pull yourself out of it. Yeah, you know, like when you get a song stuck in your head. Yeah, or you know, you get a memory feedback loop, yeah, of some pleasant event, and it just kind of gets on a feedback loop, and it's almost like a drug addict trying to go back to the first high. Yeah, you're trying to revisit a memory to get that chemical response that you got at the moment of the time it happened. And sometimes it works. Sometimes just the memory of a pleasant event can trigger a pleasant sensation, which should be good evidence to us that it wasn't from the side of the situation. Otherwise, why would a mere memory trigger a pleasant sensation, right? You would need all the actual factors there for you to have a pleasant sensation, right? But what the problem is that we become like a drug addict that is just living in hope of that high, and we revisit memories again and again, hoping to have the little ping that will trigger a pleasant rush or something. Yeah, and it works occasionally enough to keep us trying. Yeah, which means you miss out on whatever nice things are actually happening. Yeah, and you give all the credit to things that weren't even as they appeared. Yeah.
So could you go consciously down memory lane, enjoying it, knowing that this is just memories, and reflecting or talking to somebody else about memories and how nice it was, realizing that that is in the past and will not happen again?
The problem is getting lost in it, right? As soon as you get lost in nostalgia, it is a big attachment wave. And it is pleasant in the moment of, you know, revisiting it. And that's why it's very hard to let go of. But the problem is that it diminishes the potential of the present when you get lost in it. Yeah, and it is very easy to get lost in it. And part of us wants to get lost in it, right? Just like music, right? Part of you wants to completely kind of merge with the tune and kind of go off into that bliss land. And that is the very thing that kind of ruins the ability of the present. Yeah, and kind of gets our mind all cloudy and sticky and full of want. Yes.
But if I enjoy that very moment of music now, knowing that it will end.
Yeah. Only you know if it's attachment or not, right? You've got to step back from it and just check. If it were to abruptly end, would I be, oh, no? Or I would be like, oh, okay, anyway, right? And that's a good litmus test. If whatever you're sort of lost in, you think, oh, maybe I'm not attached. If it were to abruptly be interrupted, would you be annoyed? Yeah, or really disappointed? Then you know it was definitely attachment. If it were to be interrupted and you were just like sort of, oh, that was abrupt, anyway, you were probably okay. Yeah.
If you dedicate that feeling, and you isolate it as a feeling,
Mm-hmm.
it can be good or bad, but then you feel that energy and but dedicate it to the benefit of all sentient beings. Is that a way of handling it?
Yeah. I mean, you know, if you're having a really beautiful day and you think, may all sentient beings have a beautiful day like this, that's lovely. But even more lovely is to think, may all sentient beings have a beautiful day like this and realize that it doesn't exist like this from its own side.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the emptiness.
Yeah. Yep. Because, you know, otherwise it's kind of like wishing them samsaric happiness, which we do need samsaric happiness at our level, right? At our level, it's all we've got. So certain amounts are important, like resources and connections with people. But, you know, to kind of wish for more and more of that, what we want is to aspire to enlightenment, and then we'll have the everyday happiness along the way. But if we aspire for everyday happiness, then we'll only have everyday happiness with no momentum towards the goal. Do you feel the difference?
Yes.
Right? Yeah, Jill.
I still struggle a bit with the terminology around happiness and pleasure. Aren't happiness and pleasure, they're really suffering, they're just relief, whatever. I mean, I get that they don't exist inherently and that they don't come from the object that I tend to attribute them to, and that they're momentarily impermanent and will cause suffering to the extent to which I'm attached to them. But it still seems to me that at that moment, I am definitely experiencing a pleasant feeling.
Sure, yeah, you are. It's contaminated
Yeah,
happiness.
sure.
Yeah, so call it contaminated happiness.
So sometimes we're going to say there is no such thing as happiness, and I think
Happiness in samsara, no, we mean no pure happiness in samsara. It's the shorthand, right? It's that tricky thing with shorthand when you get used to a conversation, right? Like when we say everything is empty and then people are like, oh God, that sounds terrible, you know, and the rest of the sentence is of inherent existence. And you're like, oh, I'm not sure what that means, but I feel better about it, right?
I think the shorthand still
Yeah,
throws me sometimes.
yeah, yeah.
Could it be so much easier to move the furniture if it was just empty?
It's true. It's true. So keep thinking about attachment, because that is the insidious one, right? Anger, we do know better about anger, even if we still get angry, and we probably do still get angry, and we don't want to be in denial about our anger just because we're a nice, good person who's generally quite patient. If we're in denial about our anger, that's a problem. But it's easier to identify if you've put a bit of a spotlight of your introspection on, right? It's easier to catch if you're in the mood to catch it. Do you think? Whereas attachment, we don't catch attachment very often. We usually don't notice that we've gotten attached until the object of our attachment is gone. Yeah, it's when it leaves or changes that then we have the reaction of sadness or anger that we realize we were so attached. If we weren't attached, there would be no reaction of sadness or anger when it went. Yeah, that's the sign. And that, there's a lot of layers then to investigate about the nature of grief and the nature of loss and these things which are delicate, and we want to be very kind to ourselves when examining them. But, look at the relationship between grief and attachment. It's interesting. Yeah.
So is there such?
Yeah.
Is there such a thing as honourable reflection?
Honourable reflection, what's that mean?
Celebrating somebody's life.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I mean, some of our nuns are celebrants, funeral celebrants. Yeah, for sure, Chodron. It's in a way, it's like a rejoicing practice, which we'll get to, which was, here is a life well lived and qualities that we value and ways lives were enriched because of this person's presence. And it's like an honoring and a celebrating and there is a recognition that when this person is not in this body anymore, there is a loss. There is a loss, but that's not the same thing as saying, I can't be happy without them, which is what attachment says. Yeah. And it's tricky because our culture reinforces attachment behavior, because it's almost like if you don't show how sad you are, then people won't know how much you love them. Yeah. So even if you're just feeling just the kind of a touch of melancholy, but just kind of a deep contented, I'm so glad I knew you, I'm so glad we shared time together, and you're kind of okay, but the people around you are expecting you to fall apart, then you sort of have to show the aspect of falling apart so they know that you love them. Yeah? This is what we do to each other culturally, right? And it might not even be conscious, right? You might be fine until you see your loved ones, and then just kind of the pressure of their expectations, you're like, oh, and you crumple. When in fact, maybe you were fine with the loss. It was a loss, but you were just really loving how much you knew them. You weren't going into a whole pit of despair about it. So absolutely honoring. And it's recognition of loss is something that we need to do, otherwise we get kind of hardened and jaded and bitter. But over-identifying with loss then becomes a whole identity trap, doesn't it? Over-identification with loss. This is who I am. I'm the grieving widow. This is who I am, the person whose partner left them. This is who I am, the parent whose children have left the house. This is who I am. That becomes the problem. But to say there is a loss there or a transition there, that's important. And to feel whatever you're feeling, but to not fall into it. That delicate ability that we learn in meditation, which is to allow things to arise without squashing them and without feeding them. Allow things to just roll through without identifying with them or disassociating from them. That razor's edge, right? And we learn that in meditation in very calm moments, and then slowly it comes into the life with our relationships, where you can feel it, it can be there, but it's not you, and you don't cling. Yeah, it's delicate. Yeah, any other questions or comments? Does anyone have any worries? Yeah.
My sense is that a lot of these emotions have functions in particular contexts. So it's really important that if you're committed to someone or if you're caring for someone, you will miss them if they're not there.
Yeah.
So that experience of missing is also, it's a motivated state. I need to find them.
Ah, interesting, yeah.
Yeah. And fretting after death is like that. It's a continuation. But if we don't examine it, that's when the I steps in. So it shifts context.
Yeah.
It becomes, I can't survive if this person's not here, rather than I need to be with this person for a function.
Yeah.
But that capacity to stay with that strong functional emotion requires a lot of presence.
It does, yeah, and some bravery, but it's almost the bravery that comes from a deep confidence in your own Buddha nature. You can become brave if you're not identified with your negative states of mind. You can be brave if you're identified with your Buddha nature. Yeah, because then all of the other stuff is surface, coming and going. Isn't you, is a conditioned response, comes about through many causes and conditions and karmas. Is here, is real conventionally, but isn't you. But to be able to sit with it while it's kind of arising within this space needs, kind of a shift of who are you. And, your patterns of afflictions, your patterns of personality, your conditioned responses, all of your traits and your learnings, these are all fresher and newer and less a part of you than they feel, right? What's been with you the whole time from beginningless time is your Buddha nature. So to shift emphasis, right, we want to eventually get to identitylessness, right? But a nice intermediate step is to shift to my Buddha nature, my potential for growth, my Buddha nature, the ability of this mind to transform into happiness. That is actually more me than the afflictions. Does that make sense? The afflictions are then habits piled on top of that, born from innate ignorance, which sure we've also had from beginningless time. We could start to identify with our innate ignorance if we wanted to, but what's more useful, Yeah.
But going back to that sort of more the sort of functional context, it takes a while for us to functionally to forget to remember.
Yeah, right.
Or to remember
Yeah.
to forget.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, eh? Yeah. Yep, other bits.
I think this is why when you lose someone very close to you, if anybody offers you any counselling, they're probably going to offer you the stages of mourning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I have used the stages of mourning several times now, and it's a very valid way.
Absolutely.
Of getting through the period, the first year or so.
Absolutely.
Of losing someone.
Absolutely.
I had never thought of using it though as a tool to unpack the breakdown of a marriage, for example, a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or a child leaving home.
Yep.
But I can see how that would be useful too.
Yeah, all forms of what we call loss.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Loss of health, loss of whatever, Yeah, absolutely. And, I think what we want to look at with, Western psychology is that there's some really beautiful tools for coping and responding to different difficulties that happen in a life. There's really good ways of triggering the ability to be introspective and self-aware. There's some really excellent tools in Western psychology that I think we can all benefit from, whether we're defined as mentally healthy or not. There's some very good tools we can all use. And to realize that also it's coming from a perspective of just one life and from a perspective of some sort of usually core identity, which is not completely wrong. As Chetsuma Tenzin Palmo says, you need a very healthy identity, a very healthy ego before you can break it apart. If you start from a broken place, then you dissolve into madness. Yeah, so it's kind of like you do need to kind of patch yourself up and sort out your family of origin issues and get kind of, integrated. And then you can crash it apart. It's fine. But if you start crashing before you're kind of grounded, chaos. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So I suppose my question here is why, when you have a set of siblings, are they all going to be different? But that would be their karma from
Previous lives.
previous life.
It's,
Because
yeah.
there's no assumption that we've always been in the same
In the same family.
family group each time
Yeah.
we've lived.
Yep, we're just cycling around, pinging around. We do get kind of karmic groupings, yeah, where we've bumped into each other many, many times, and other people we haven't bumped into as often. We bumped into probably every being that exists at some point or another, beginningless time being what it is, right? But we do get kind of these little pods and clusters of karmic relationships where it gets a little bit incestuous, right? Like, so you've been mothers and daughters and friends and lovers and all of these things, but you've been around each other for pets, and you've been around each other a long time. And that's another way to manage your grief, too, in a worldly way, is to think, well, I'm going to meet them again, because I just, probably whether I want to or not, because we have this kind of karmic connection with each other. And we already know what that feels like, even if we haven't defined it. That feeling when you meet someone for the first time, but they feel familiar. And you just sort of pick up where you left off. And then you're like, oh, wait, what's your name? Right? But it's like you've always known them, because you have always, you've known them for ages. And then people you can know for 20 years, you feel like, I still have no idea who you are, because it's a newer sort of connection, and maybe they have various issues too, but it's a newer connection, right? But I think what we take from the Buddhist perspective around grief is also that grief is not like this living entity that then you have to carry forever and kind of grow a life around to sort of give yourself more life to cope with this glunk of grief that's always going to be with you. Actually, grief can actually go. Yeah, which is not necessarily what all Western psychology believes. Some forms, some schools of thought seem to think you will always have this terrible grief, but you can build a life that's big enough to cope with that fact.
You might have it, but it won't be terrible. It fades.
It does fade if you let it. It's just we sometimes don't let it because we feel like that dishonors the person who's gone. Like we have to keep poking at our grief to like liven it up again. Otherwise we didn't care about them.
To be upset.
Yeah.
Is to remember.
Absolutely. It's an unfortunate habit we've conditioned ourselves into. That, it will show I don't value them unless I get upset about them at significant anniversaries and remember them, when the light's a certain way, right? Yeah, it's a hard thing that we do to ourselves. Yeah. Yeah.
And you tend to not let them go that way as well.
Yeah.
Keeping them.
Yeah.
It's difficult for them as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially in those last stages, sometimes the dying person is at more peace than the people around them. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyway, these are, this is not a weekend course project really to be finished with, These things are everyday things, and a lot of our teachers say the Four Immeasurable Thoughts before every class and after every class and every morning, and just to kind of wake them up in your mind so that they are the way that you live by. Because again, they're not exclusively Buddhist Buddhist topics, are they? They're something that anyone can value and practice. How deeply you go with them and what perspective you come to them with, of course, is based on your background, religious belief system, spiritual belief system, humanitarian belief system, whatever. But the words themselves, the concepts themselves, at some level are accessible to everyone. So slowly. Yeah. So Immeasurable Joy is one of these ones where it does get talked about in a little bit different angle depending on the Pali tradition, the Theravadan folks, or the Sanskrit tradition, the Mahayana folks. And both are really beautiful practices, and they do go together. They're just a slightly different nuance. So with the Pali perspective, Immeasurable Joy has this connotation of sympathetic joy or empathic joy, happy for someone's happiness. Yeah? So when someone else is happy, you're happy with them. And, so you are having a feeling of happiness in response to their happiness. And it's a skill to be developed, right? And you can't force it right away, but you can sort of choose to direct your mind in a way where you sort of say to yourself, I'm so happy that they're happy. And then you start to actually be happy. Whereas, with people that we already love and have a strong relationship with, when they're happy, we're very happy. We don't have to think about it. Yeah, do you know that feeling, right? When someone you love is just really upbeat and feeling quite cheerful and they're having a great day, you're so happy to see them happy. Yeah. What we're trying to get is anytime we see someone happy, to be happy for them. What would be the benefit of that? Or the point of that?
Not have jealousy.
Not have jealousy, definitely coming from the Mahayana over there. But yeah, actually from the Pali perspective as well. Yeah, it does help with jealousy. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it does. It also increases closeness. Yeah, it increases closeness, doesn't it? When you're happy, when someone else is happy. It starts to dissolve barriers in terms of, distinction between me and you. Those barriers, aren't really there anyway, but you start to feel the lack of barrier when you're sort of feeling with someone's happiness. Yeah. It's an interesting perspective, and I like it, and there's a lot of beautiful literature about sympathetic joy in the Pali tradition, and I think Thich Nhat Hanh also talks about it a little bit from that nuance as well. In the Sanskrit tradition, in the Mahayana tradition, that's an element, but it's more consciously rejoicing in other people's positive actions. So you're not just rejoicing in their happiness. You're rejoicing in their positive actions of body, speech, and mind. So when you see someone being kind, when you see someone being generous, when you see someone working on their spiritual path, then you have happiness for that. Does that make sense? Right, and so it starts as an intellectual process and then sort of drops into an experience of real happiness yourself. So the practice that we do a lot in our tradition is you first sit with, what are your own good things you've been getting up to? Rejoicing in your own positive actions, which feels a little uncomfortable at first, right? To go through, here's all the things I'm doing well. Like, it feels a little hokey, right? It's like there's a cheesiness and you sort of cringe and you're like, yay. Yeah. So it is cringy, but what it does, if you can kind of like move past the cheese factor and just like touch what's being said here, is that when you rejoice in what you're doing well, you're more likely to do more of it. Yeah. When you rejoice in the things that you're kind with, the things that you're patient with, the things that you're generous with, etc., it gives you momentum to proceed. Yeah. And it also helps lift the mind and make it happy, because a lot of our practice is about looking at our faults, right? Looking at the negative states of mind, looking how they ruin our peace, being self-aware of the ways we harm ourselves and others. A lot of the gaze is a critical gaze, not a mean gaze, but a real gaze that's looking for fault, right? Like, oops, attachment, oops, anger, right? And that's a lot of our day. And at the end of the day, we're doing purification practice to get rid of the negative karma's ability to produce suffering that we've done that day. So very healthy then is to finish off the day with then rejoicing in, do you know what? Normally I get really grumpy in traffic, and today I gave myself that extra time and that extra pep talk, and I was not grumpy in traffic. And it was horrible traffic. Well done, me. Right? Like, and part of you's like, yay, right? But actually, if you can really touch the fact that that is something that is difficult, that I was disciplined with my mind with, and I actually kept myself from a negative state of mind at a point at which it normally arises. That is success, right? And I might forget tomorrow, but let's just take a minute. That was good. Let's do more of that. And you're also thinking, and I was happier then at the end of it. And when I got home, I wasn't so grumpy with the people in my house, right? I didn't have to have the whole unwind 20 minutes of being obnoxious while I settled down from traffic. That was nice for them, yeah. But, so you're rejoicing in ordinary things like that, but you also are rejoicing in the fact that you have a spiritual path that you're trying to live by. So anytime you remembered your spiritual path, anytime you connected back with your motivation. Does it make sense? So it is an interesting thing to play with, because it is not at all how we're brought up, especially Australians and people with sort of an English kind of influence. It's particularly cringy, right? It's cringy. But if you can just kind of step back from it from a minute and say, do you know what? I know everything good I've done is a dependent arising. Yeah, that it's had tons of causes and conditions and support to arise, but I'm allowed to be happy that it happened. I'm allowed to be happy that it happened. And what's more, I should be happy that it happened, because this is what I'm trying to live by. Yeah. How do you sit with that first step of starting with yourself before you go out? I mean, what kind of obstacles do you feel coming up with that, or insights?
Culturally, as you say, it's not something that we do in Australia. It's more, dare I say it, American.
It is very American, yes. No, I can say that with confidence.
You know, we don't,
Yes.
we don't fly flags. We don't praise ourselves to the hilt.
Only with rugby.
I'm sport illiterate.
No, I know you don't. And you know, and Americans do in a way that's not really rejoicing. It's kind of like ego flattery, right? The way in which Americans do, like, I am amazing. I just want to really celebrate myself right now, because, you know, that is cringy as hell and not useful.
Many of my generation, I think, are pretty cringy with the way our grandchildren's generation are being brought up to. You know, they've got to have validation, they've got to have celebration, they've got to have all this.
No, it's not useful. No, I mean, it's useful in the right context with the right motivation, but the need for constant validation and you know, it really does trigger kind of our narcissistic tendencies, and our self-cherishing can really get inflamed. And the more self-cherishing and narcissism you have, the more suffering you have, and the more alienating you are to other people. And this is not what we're talking about.
And it manifests itself in companies these days constantly wanting feedback.
Yes, feedback. Yes.
I don't give feedback.
You can say, well, I didn't like it. Right. No, and so it's really important to unpack that, because you're quite right. That is the connotation we hear when we hear rejoicing, is neurotic American validation, or ambition that is ego-based, or flattery, or it's yuck. Like, it could go yuck so quickly, right? And what's really the case when you're rejoicing in your own positive qualities is that you're very quietly giving yourself validation so that no one else has to, right? You don't need external validation. You don't need people to say you're doing a good job. You've sat with yourself with some self-honesty, and this is right after usually a purification practice where you've gone through all your dodginess for the day too, right? You're like, all right, so breakfast, how was breakfast? Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Yep, that telemarketer called at breakfast and I was abrupt and grumpy with them. That was not great. Okay, then what happened? And then, you know, that person knocked at the door, and instead of being grumpy with them, I let them in and gave them coffee. That was good. You know, you're just going through your day, right? But the thing is that it's hard for us to be patient to go through our day in this way, because we're so used to autopilot. We're so used to just going through the motions of our day, and we know there's things we could do better, and there's things we do fine at. We know that. We don't really, you know, and we're like, why do we need to think about it? We know. But to actually come very conscious and intentional with, what was I saying to myself today? What was I saying to myself today? Some of it was really not useful, and some of it actually is a sign of a good habit I want to continue. So the whole way this becomes non-cringy is if you are not identified with the good or the bad, but taking responsibility for both. Does it make sense? Yeah. Yeah, and you know, so if I'm doing my rejoicing practice, you know, some of it, there's a lot of repeating, right? Of if you have vows, right? If you have the lay vows, like not to kill or not to steal, you have those every single day, whether you remember that you have them or not. They probably do kick in when the moment comes to make the other choice, right? You might not remember actively that you have a no-killing vow, but when there's a little spider run across your kitchen bench, you just gently catch it and put it outside, almost without thinking, but because you've really integrated your no-killing vow, and that no-killing vow is really protecting your mind from harming others. And to you, it's not a big deal, because you do it so naturally now. But it is a big deal in the great scheme of the spiritual path as an essential habit you need for progress. Because if you keep killing every single spider that goes across your bench, every life you're going to have the karma for illness and untimely death. And that is going to really interrupt momentum. That means that every animal that you harm, now you have a negative relationship with, and the next time you meet, there's going to be some fear response or some anger response, right? So this little tiny thing of, you know, yeah, you have your killing vow, you've had it for 30 years, whatever. it's not whatever. It's a huge deal. And so thinking of that each day, it's enriching. Yeah, it's enriching. It's like, yeah, okay, let's keep going with this. And let's actually, maybe I can expand it and maybe take bodhisattva vows, maybe take tantric vows, and just see how much positive I can bring to the world. If you're never looking at what you're doing well already, sometimes you don't have any will to kind of take the next step forward with it either. Or you start thinking you're really crap and get down on yourself when in fact you're doing lots that's really beautiful. Yeah, so just, play with it in your mind so that you don't get the cringe of, oh no, Oprah, right? Right? Bless her, right? Just play with it so it gets to the right place and just go through, yep, actually, I'm a good partner or I'm a good pet owner or whatever, right? And take a minute for that, yeah.
I was just thinking how important it would be to teach our children the difference between, because I watch my 7-year-old grandson playing soccer. So instead of if he kicks a goal, go yes, to the others.
Yeah.
So it's the gloating part.
Yeah.
And to explain the difference between joy and gloating.
Yeah.
It's so important at that age.
Absolutely.
So they know, be joyful is fine.
Yeah.
Gloating is not fine, but it's not being taught. They just
Yeah. Well, and the parents reinforce it. Yeah, you can be, oh my gosh, you made a goal. You were really watching for the opening and you really practiced well. That was really excellent. Yeah, you saw the opening and you really went for it and you've been practicing so hard. Excellent. Yeah. Nothing to do with the other side, only to do with your own development as a sporty, whatever. Yeah. Yeah, you can be happy without putting people down. That's a huge lesson that some of us never learn, right? You can be happy without putting anyone down. Yeah, there's simple truths, but we forget or we never learn properly, and so part of us, as soon as we see other people doing well, we immediately compare ourselves and go, yeah, I could do that. I could do that. Yeah, or it's not so great that they can do that. They had all that help. Yeah, and we have that real, hair toss, right? Right, internal hair toss. I could do that. Yeah. Right. But it's interesting. And so this rejoicing practice also, you have to make sure that it doesn't slip into, okay, I just gave $20 to Doctors Without Borders. That was great. I'm so happy about that. And then your rich friend who gives $1,000 every year, and you're like, Yeah, you can't do that kind of comparison, right? Because everyone has different circumstances and abilities and motivations and etc., right? You can be happy that you gave $20 and then think about your friend who gave $1,000 and also be happy. Yeah, right? It doesn't have to be like competitive happiness. Yeah. Exactly. So you start with yourself, and then the thing that you do next, which is really beautiful for having really good relationships in your life, actually, because it's something never spoken, but it is really felt, especially with difficult relationships, is if you think about the people in your life and you rejoice in what they're doing well in terms of positive actions that are of benefit to society or to the greater good or to the spiritual path. Particularly the people in your life that you don't like, right? If you think about what you respect about them, what you like that they're doing, what you value, actually it will soften the edge when you're actually with them. And you never say it, right? It's never spoken unless it's appropriate. But doing that, actually, it really does change the dynamic, and it's such a cool experiment to do if you're having issues with someone. If you're just at home by yourself, just think, do you know what? Actually, they're really efficient. Do you know what? Actually, they're really good in a meeting. They keep things going. They take good minutes, blah, blah. You really go through the things you appreciate about them. And then when you see them again, there is often a softening, often even from their side. Yeah, it's as if they've felt all of that, because sometimes they do, right? It's not like the consciousness is contained in the physical form. We know that from all the times we've picked up the phone before it rang. Yeah, the times that we were thinking of someone as the email from them popped up into the inbox, right? Our consciousness isn't contained just in the body. It's leaking all the time, right? So it's a useful thing. It's a useful thing for those difficult relationships, but it's also a useful thing for the people that we love and are very close to, for them to sort of feel our gratitude for them, our seeing of them, all that kind of stuff. And then often you don't have to say it very often. They feel it. They feel that you see and appreciate them. Yeah. And then when the right time is to say something, you have things on the tip of your tongue. Now, the karmic benefit of rejoicing is that it maximizes your merit. So for those of you that do believe in karma, rejoicing is a very efficient way to get more mental momentum. Yeah, more merit, more positive karma. So as soon as you rejoice in the activity of a peer, you have the same merit as if you'd done it too. Ha-ha! Right? I know, it's a weird way of thinking, but it's an interesting thing to kind of play with of why would that be? Why would that be? Well, if you're rejoicing in the full positive action of another person, what is karma? It's intention, right? You know, so there you go.
So does that work with it, like strangers?
Yeah.
You see things that people are doing that are amazing.
Absolutely. Right? Like you're thinking about the divers and the cave boys and going, rock on divers, rock on cave boys, right? Like amazing, like that they really made it through whatever, you know, or yeah, and to really consciously, the aid organizations that you might support financially or with volunteer work, you can also support mentally and, you know, maximize your karmic impact, right? Because now all of the work of now Doctors Without Borders, you can just stay at home. No, but it has to be genuine, right? Or else it doesn't work. But, you know, to really think of, I am so glad that that happens. I am so happy that they do that, right? The organizations that we support to just like sit with that, I'm so glad that they do that. It's so important that that happens, you know, and just going through each one. Again, it helps also lift your idea of how the world is, you know, because it's not like the news does equal airtime of good news and bad news. Yeah.
We talked about politicians yesterday, bad ones and so on. Isn't this a way to try to negate a lot of the issues that are going on?
Yep.
I think a number of issues got negated yesterday, didn't they?
Sure, but from the perspective of what is going right, what is being done well, to try and find them.
Absolutely, and it clarifies your own values as well. You know what your values are in a kind of amorphous way. You have your ethics and your morality in a kind of abstract way, but it actually can quite crystallize for you what is it that you find important, you know, and what is the thing you want to find even more important to give even more energy to, right? It can really help. And so you do this with the people you actually know, and then you radiate out to the people that you don't know, but you know of, that are doing beautiful things. And then you go on to rejoicing in the activities of the bodhisattvas, those people still on the path but are doing amazing things, and then the Buddhas themselves. So you're just doing this radiating out of rejoicing practice, and it gives you will, it gives you momentum to do the same. It gives you a connection with them. It reminds you that they're there. It's an interesting kind of joy that gets triggered. It's a deep contentment. It's not bouncy. It's not excited, right? It's not a sugar high. It's not a child at a carnival. It's a deep contentment, thinking about what's going well. Yeah.
So whether it's towards the person or the action, it's our searching for. It's our process of engaging with that intention.
Yep, exactly.
It doesn't matter whether it doesn't matter whether we're extending, rejoicing in the person who's done that or the action that's been done. In either way, we're going beyond ourselves with that.
Yeah, like that. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And anything that widens your gaze will help with the self-cherishing thought, right? Self-cherishing is that attitude that views yourself as primary importance and works for its welfare at the expense of others or with indifference to others, right? And that self-cherishing thought is the direct kind of troublemaker in our life, the self-cherishing thought. So as soon as you start thinking of others, you're widening the gaze. The self-cherishing thought is what narrows it, yeah? And so anything that consciously widens that is going to give you a lot more space, a lot more flexibility, but also a lot less like preciousness, yeah? And like a lot less fragility and a lot less defensiveness and all of those things that self-cherishing will trigger in us, yeah? So the third kind of, or the third aspect of immeasurable joy or perspective with it is this aspirational joy, which is wishing for, right? What do we want for people? Of course, we want them to have temporary happiness and samsaric happiness to a point, but what we really want for them is the peace of nirvana. What we really, really want for them is for them to become a Buddha. Yeah. So what we want for them is to have the happiness that is without suffering. Yeah. And so when you're reading the Four Immeasurables, you're like, okay, sentient beings, may they have happiness and the causes of happiness, suffering, and freedom from the causes of suffering. The happiness without suffering, part of you goes, didn't we just say that? Right? Didn't we just say that? No, but what we're wanting is a special type of happiness, the happiness that is free from suffering, the stable happiness that comes from internal development. Yeah. Sure, we want them to have cake and puppies and, fun times, but what we really want for them is nirvana. Yeah, what we really want for them is a stable, unchanging happiness that's not destroyed by negative states of mind. And even more than that, from the Mahayana perspective, we want them to perfect themselves completely to omniscience, right? We want full Buddhahood, full enlightenment, so they can then be of greatest benefit to other sentient beings. Does it make sense? So these are the three aspects. And so joy is a pretty, it's an easy enough one to talk through. And so at the end of today, we'll do just a brief rejoicing practice, hopefully in a non-cringy American way, as a kind of wrap up for the course to kind of model how you would do it at the end of each day. And then the rest of today, we're going to really focus on equanimity because there's so many different angles to go with it. And if we're really on a roll, we can add Tonglen to the Four Immeasurable Thoughts. And if we're really on a roll, we can talk about the jhanas and the concentration states that go together with the Four Immeasurables. But we'll just see how we go. Yeah, so we won't push or pull, just see how we go with pacing. But the handout that you got today is a new handout, and it's got a lot of different stuff in it. So have a little browse through in the breaks if you like. And the cover is just a cover I made for when I do this in the Middle East, but I thought you guys might like it too because other languages are pretty.
Yeah,
okay. Right. So we'll stop, have a cup of tea, and come back at 11:30.